He was looking at the bill on the table. It was supposed to be $50 in total, but he didn't order much food. The people who worked there had different ideas for him than just giving him a meal. When he saw the very high bill, he got really angry. They didn't realize that he wouldn't accept it, even though he was old and not very strong. He was determined to make them pay for it. He didn't want to pay such a big bill, and he thought he had the right to do that. It didn't matter to him if he went against the rules. Knowing the truth about the old man's past would certainly have made the staff more cautious. Despite his unassuming appearance, he was anything but weak. Pat stared daggers at the waitress when she returned. "Is there a reason for this fee?" he asked, already knowing. "Sir, you repeatedly ignored our requests and broke our policy. This is the consequence." A feeling of rage coursed through Pat's body. A sudden calm came over him. "I didn't expect to pay so much. I just need to get some cash out of my trunk. Don't worry, it's right outside. If you want to watch me, you can." Despite rolling her eyes, the waitress didn't appear to object. Through the front window, Pat noticed the waitress watching him as he walked out of the restaurant. Keeping an eye on him made sure he didn't do anything suspicious. But that's exactly what the old man was going to do. He walked over to his trunk and opened it, a grin on his face. After grabbing the duffel bag, the veteran stared at the restaurant. He didn't want to do it, but he was forced to. His throat was cleared as he returned to the front door. The waitress's face was free of annoyance. After unzipping his duffel bag, he pulled out something nobody had expected. Patrick Abner felt hard done by, even on days when others would have been happy to face the day. He sometimes didn't understand the point of getting up in the morning. He still felt heartbreak, just as if it happened yesterday. There had been a lot of trauma in his life, but one event shattered his heart. In his early 20s, Pat decided to enlist in the United States Army and fight overseas. The Vietnam War was a war of politics, and he did not realize how much politics was involved. Following his return from war, Pat met a woman named Joanna and tried to forget about his past. His life had never been happier, but he had no idea what would happen next. His best efforts were put into raising the two boys. There were many differences between the two boys despite the fact that they were twins. Meanwhile, John focused more on his mother's passions. She loved cooking tasty meals for her family and spoiling them with delicious treats. Time flew by, and Pat couldn't believe that his children had already grown into young adults. John moved out first, finding his passion in hospitality. Derek, on the other hand, stayed for another year before doing the unexpected. With the war in Iraq in full swing, Derek told his parents that he was going to listen to the call and protect them. But it wouldn't end well. Pat tried to give his son some perspective on war, but with how patriotic he was, there was no stopping him. Pat and Joanna worried about him every day, and until one day they got a letter hand-delivered from a soldier. It was the worst news. Their son Derek had been killed in action. They would never recover from this. Pat felt powerless to console his wife as he watched her slip further into depression every day. The married couple grew apart after losing their son. Pat realized he couldn't help his wife, and they got a divorce. Joanna kept the house, and Pat became a wanderer. He moved to New York, but found it no friendlier than before. For 20 years, he roamed doing odd jobs to survive. He cherished two things: Derek's baseball cap and an old photo. He took them before leaving home. One day, he heard about a new restaurant in New York and decided to try it. As he sat down, the food reminded him of his wife's cooking, but someone was about to disrupt his day. Suddenly, a female voice caught his attention. "Hello, can I get you anything to drink?" She sounded mean and unkind, but then Pat lowered the menu so she could see his face. Her smile immediately dropped. Something was wrong, but how had he offended her? She was about to tell him, "Sorry, sir, but you can't wear a hat inside," she said in an annoyed tone. He couldn't believe what she had just said. "Sorry, but I have to keep it on. It was my son's." But before he could finish explaining, she cut him off. "Well, it doesn't matter whose it was. That's our policy." Pat decided to stand his ground. "I'm not taking it off, young lady," he said in his stern voice. The woman scoffed and stormed off. He thought that was the end of it, but he was mistaken. Pat managed to order food from the waitress when she came back and quickly got some amazing-looking food. It tasted just like home and comforted him in ways he hadn't been in decades. He nearly cried but kept his composure. He asked for the bill, but what he saw was shocking. Pat looked at the bill, and it was supposed to be $50. He hadn't ordered much because he didn't have a lot of money, but the restaurant staff had different ideas. The bill made him really angry because it was way too expensive, and they thought he was weak because he was old. He decided he wouldn't pay such a high bill just to stand up for his rights. Pat was already feeling upset, and this situation was making it worse. He had a tough past from his time in the war, and this encounter brought back those painful memories. The waitress had picked the wrong person to mess with. She thought an old man like Pat wouldn't fight back, but she underestimated him. As time passed, he came up with a plan to get back at her. She wouldn't see it coming, and when it happened, it would be too late. He looked around the restaurant and found the waitress talking to another coworker. They were laughing and looking at him. Soon, everyone in the restaurant would regret treating him this way. He waved her over and watched as she walked over with a cocky grin on her face. The waitress came back and Pat stared daggers at her. "What's this fee for?" "Sir, you broke our policy and repeatedly ignored our requests. This is the repercussion." "Okay, I didn't count on paying so much. Let me just get some cash from my trunk. Don't worry, it's right by the window." He couldn't believe they were about to let him make it to his car. Once he did, they would be the ones begging for his mercy. Pat walked out of the restaurant and noticed the waitress watching him through the front window. He walked over to his trunk and opened it, a grin on his face. The veteran grabbed the duffel bag and stared back at the restaurant. The look of annoyance was wiped off the waitress's face. It had been replaced by fear as he unzipped his duffel bag and pulled out something no one expected. What he grabbed was an old Polaroid. "Do you know who this is?" he said, with tears streaming down his face. It was a photo of a young man smiling at the camera. "This is my son, Derek, and he died fighting for this country. If he had survived, would you have treated him as bad as you are to me?" But he wasn't finished. "And this hat, this is his hat. It's the only piece of him I have left, and that's why I'm not taking it off for you or anyone." He finally finished his emotional rant. Seeing the scene he created, the waitress stared at him before saying, "I'm getting the owner," before running into the back. Pat sat down and smiled. He was in on some info that the waitress lacked. The owner, head cook, and manager came out. But it was one man who held all of those titles in this humble diner restaurant. He cooked with a passion and finally managed to open his restaurant after 20 years of trying. "There he is," the waitress said as she pointed at the ragged man in the corner. She had no idea what was about to happen. As soon as the owner saw Pat, something stirred inside of him. He stumbled on his words. "Dad," he choked out before rushing towards Pat. The old grizzled man knew about his son's restaurant and wanted to support him, but he hadn't told his son he was coming. John didn't even know he lived in the same city as him. The two hugged tightly, and then Pat began to explain what had happened. He said, "The waitress wanted to charge me $300 just for keeping my hat on. That's a ridiculous rule," he told his son. But then John, his son, looked surprised and said, "What rule? We don't have any rule about wearing hats here." He glanced back at the waitress, who realized she was in big trouble. It turned out she had been making up unfair rules to take advantage of vulnerable customers. John immediately fired her. He took her apron and watched her leave the restaurant. Then he turned to his father, who had been lost and without a purpose for many years. John said something that Pat had only dreamed of hearing. "Dad, I didn't know where you've been. I know you felt guilty about Derek, but it's time for you to come home. Okay, I have an extra room and I'd love for you to meet my family." Pat couldn't believe what he was hearing. He cried in his son's arms. He would never be alone again.